Hey everybody, let's talk about creating basic files in Adobe InDesign and setting up our pages using margins and guides and the other things that are really useful in setting up a graphic design project. So here we go. Now, depending on which version of InDesign you're using, you're going to get a different little welcome screen. But on the most common ones, the most common edition that's out there that everybody's using, you should have some sort of a little preview window and a create new button. And once we select that create new button, we're going to get some preset sizes and styles we need for our documents. Now, InDesign is the preferred program for setting up multi-page and complex layouts for graphic design projects. It really is the best mixture of Adobe Illustrator, Photoshop, kind of your way to put everything together. When you're working on your graphics and your logos, you're going to be doing that in Illustrator and setting up AI files or EPS files. You're working on your images, background images, or little feature images. You're going to be doing that in Photoshop and setting the resolution and the color scheme. And then you're going to cobble that together in InDesign with your text. And it's kind of the best process. It's a good idea to avoid using, let's say, Photoshop for a brochure design project. That's a big no-no. Never want to do that. Same as you want to avoid using Illustrator for a photo project. Essentially, you do all the separate pieces and then you put it all together in InDesign. So looking at your presets here, you've got a lot of typical choices. You've got recent, saved, print, web, mobile. So they already kind of predict what you're going to be using Illustrator for, or I'm sorry, InDesign for. I'm going to select print, and depending on which measuring system you've set up, it's going to tell you either the metric, point, pica, or inch measurements for your document. I typically switch to inches because that's how my brain thinks. And you've got the preset sizes of letter, legal, tabloid, etc. Now you can customize your size, whatever you need, but for me, I'm going to stick for this basic demonstration, letter size. And then if we look at the different choices, elements we can set up here on the side. You have, in addition, the orientation of the page. Do you want landscape or portrait? Then you've also got whether or not you need facing pages. Now, facing pages is something that really only matters if you're going to do more than one page in your document. This is just a single page, so I'm going to uncheck that. But if I was doing a book design or a magazine layout, I might select facing pages, and that gives me the opportunity to have spreads inside my document. You can set the number of pages right here, columns, margins, all of that. There's a big difference between margins and bleeds. It's always a good idea to set a reasonable margin for your document depending on what size it is. Typical letter size margin is about 1/2 inch around the edge. And what's that? That's your safe zone. That means that your document, you don't want anything to go closer than 1/2 inch from the edge of the page. It's just a good rule of thumb. But if you need to reduce that or change that, you just click these little arrows and scale it up or scale it down. Now your bleed is an important measurement, especially for full color, full page images. So let's say you've got a background color or a background image that you need to go beyond the edge of your printed page. You always want to set a bleed of at least 0.125 or 1/8 of an inch. And you want to make sure that your graphics and your color extends beyond the edge of the 8.5 by 11 or page size that you've established for your document. A lot of people forget that, especially in our digital world. People ignore that setting, but it really is important to pay attention to the bleed, especially when you're printing your work. All right, now slug area and all that, that's kind of something you can worry about when you do imposition and more complex layouts, so you can pretty much ignore it. In this case, I'm going to hit OK and just hit create. And you're going to see now my document has the white page, the red line, which is the bleed, and the pink line on the inside, which is your margin. Now let's talk about guides for a second. Very helpful to have guides or a grid system of some kind established in your document so that you can make a consistent, uniform, or thought out symmetrical or asymmetrical design on your page. And so you can make manual guides and decide for yourself where to put them and how to divide up your space. Those are done pretty simply by using the ruler bar. And if you don't see the ruler bar visible, go to the View menu and you select Show Rulers. Mine are visible, so it's Hide Rulers. But if you press Command R, you can show or hide those rulers. And what you do with your selection arrow is you actually click on the ruler bar and drag down a guide. And that guide is now movable on your page, and you can position it anywhere you want. This guide doesn't print. It's only there as a visual element to help you compose your page, make sure that you have things in the right spot. Or maybe you want to have another side guide, and maybe you're going to have a text box for a title, another image box for an image, other things like that that are laid out on your page, and you want to get them to line up together. So it's good to make a little guide so that they snap to the guide, those objects and boxes stick to those page edges, and you can use them. Now, if you don't want to go custom on laying out the guides you need and you want to use more of a traditional grid, if you go to Preferences, under the InDesign menu, go to Preferences and go to Grids. You can set up the different settings you want for that grid. In this case, it has a document grid here, and it says it's going to make a grid line every 1 inch and subdivide that grid by 8 spaces. So basically, you're using a 1 inch grid, and it's subdivided into 1/8 inch squares. And here it says grids in the back. So I'm going to click OK. And then under the View menu, I'm going to select Grids and Guides. And I'm going to select Show Document Grid under the View menu. So this is where you kind of turn them on and off. So now that's a really useful thing that I've got that grid in place that I could use to align my objects and set up my page in a uniform manner. I'm going to go ahead and turn that one off. Go back to the same menu, View, Grids, Guides, Hide Document Grid. This time I'm going to show something else. I'm going to go back to that same menu, and this time I'm going to show Baseline Grid. Now in typography, we know that the baseline is the shelf, or the measuring line that all letters rest on. That baseline grid is where you have your lowercase letters, and your letters extend below as descenders or above as ascenders, right? So I'm going to click Baseline Grid. Now your baseline grid is based on typical typesetting document settings. So in this case, we have I believe it's going to be a 12-point baseline grid based on the 12-point type, which might be the default setting for this text. So let's say I go over here to my toolbar and I draw out a text box, and I'm going to go ahead and align it with that baseline grid and draw it out. To see what this does, I'm going to go to the Type menu, and I'm going to select a little option called Fill with Placeholder Text. What that does is it just gives you dummy text that fills any text box, and you can see what it looks like. Okay, so what has that done? What that has done is it has filled up that text with that text box with random text. And here I've got that text inside and that text box, and you can see how it does or it doesn't line up with that baseline grid. Now, I do believe, let me triple click that to highlight the text. If I look at the line spacing setting here under my font size, it's set to 14.4. Okay, now I'm going to go back to my preferences, and I'm going to go to grids. And the baseline grid is set to 12 point. Okay, my font size is 12 point, but the leading, the line spacing is set to 14.4 for this typeface. So if I want my document to match my font, I'm going to need to change this increment here to 14.4. What does that do? That makes the baseline line up with the font size that I happen to be using there. So I'm going to click OK. And now you'll see that if I move and adjust that text so that it rests on that baseline, now that text box and the text inside it lines up with the baseline grid. Now, I just did that as a demonstration. You can modify this however you wish. It really depends on the preferred font size you're using for the copy in your design. And that's going to change depending on the font you use. Some fonts work better a little bit smaller, some work better a little bit bigger. You may be designing a flyer, you may be designing a poster. Those variables change the size you're going to be using. And so you're going to have to make an adjustment on your baseline grid if you're using it as a design element. But what does this do for you? Well, this means that when you set up another text box somewhere else on the page and you need those things to be consistent and have a consistent look, by using a baseline grid, you know that even if you reposition a text box somewhere else on the page, you'll be able to line it up, and those lines of text, visually speaking, need to mirror one another. And so separate text boxes in different positions on the page, as long as their baselines line up, visually that's a very pleasing element. And so you want to make sure to pay attention to that when you're doing your text layout. Here's what it looks like if I got rid of that temporarily, if I got rid of that guide. By the way, under the View menu, there is a screen mode. And a lot of people switch back and forth between what we call normal and preview. And if you select preview, that's going to give you the look of the page without all the invisible guides and stuff. This is really useful when you're testing a design, when you're noodling it. You've got your guides and grids there to help you arrange things, and then you switch to preview mode real fast so you can take a look and see if it's working. So if that text box was a little off and it wasn't lined up properly, visually that just doesn't work. Okay, so I think that's enough about baselines and guides and grids. Just know that you can customize it however you need, and you need to match your grid or your guides to your composition scheme. Are you using a typical page layout? Are you trying to do something more dynamic with diagonal lines or something like that? Unfortunately, typical guides and grids inside InDesign and Illustrator are perpendicular, straight, square. You can't really easily set up diagonal lines. Those have to be kind of created in a custom fashion. But for your typical typesetting, you're going to want to stick with a typical perpendicular grid anyways. All right, so I think that helps with that a little bit. Maybe what we'll do next is talk about how to work with text boxes and image boxes. So let me turn off the guides so it's a little easier to see. All right. Now, when working with a text box, what you're doing is you're using that type tool and you're going to draw that box. Something that confuses people, especially newbies, is how do you manipulate that? Well, you've got to go back to your selection tool. That selection tool is what's going to allow you to grab the text box, scale it if you grab a scaling dial, reposition it, enlarge it, rotate it. Pay attention to where you put the cursor because it changes what that text box does, okay? That cursor is going to change. When you're hovering over a corner, it's going to give you a rotate. When you're hovering over an edge, it's going to give you a scale. When you're centered, your mouse is centered, it allows you to move. All right, so those are the typical controls that you have using that selection arrow in combination with your text box. Now, if you have text you're bringing in from another document, like say a Word document, you can just go to that document, copy, paste it. There is a more complex process you can use to place the text if you want, or if you're going to type it in, or if you're just doing a visual mock-up, don't forget you can always use that placeholder text to fill up a text box with that font. just to test it out. All right, now let's talk about picture boxes because they're slightly different, and they're a little bit different than how they work in Illustrator also. So if you're used to Illustrator or you're thinking in terms like Photoshop, might be a little confusing. So over here on the side, you have a rectangle tool. There is a rectangle frame tool, which is a picture box, and then you just have a rectangle tool, which is a vector shape. So we're talking about the rectangle frame. You can tell it's a picture box because it has a little X on it. So I'm going to click that, drag and drop it onto my page. Fantastic. Well, it doesn't really do anything until I drop an image in. So to do that, it's highlighted, and it's highlighted because I drew it. If I let go of it for some reason, I definitely need to click it with the selection arrow, make sure that box is selected. And I'm going to go to the File menu, and I'm going to say Place. All right, so let me quickly grab a image to place inside this, this document so we can test and see what it's like. So let's say I say Open and place that inside that document. Now, that picture has shown up in my picture box, and it's there. And if I use the selection arrow, I can move that picture box on my page. Now, here's a little issue. You might be tempted to select this circular dial in the middle. Okay, that little dial is how you control the picture inside the picture box. Not the text box, I mean, not the image box itself, not the frame, but the picture inside. Now watch, when I click on it and move it, you see this semi-transparent view of the picture. That's telling you that the picture is larger than the picture window, and I can move it and reposition it within the boundary of that picture box. Okay? That's just the way it is. Image files that come from Photoshop or somewhere else are their own size and scale that are out of proportion to whatever document you happen to be using. Same is true if you download an image from the internet. It may be low res and it's the wrong size and it doesn't fit in the picture box you need, the way you need it to. So one way to modify an image once it's inside your picture box is to use the white arrow, the direct selection tool. So what you do is you select that white arrow and you click inside the picture box, and it may be subtle on the screen here, but notice how the yellow frame appears around the boundary of the actual picture. That's allowing you to grab and scale and resize that image within the picture box. And so if I drag it, notice how it resizes that picture, and it allows me to move it and slide it around and kind of resize it to fit the picture box. Again, this is all because these things are out of proportion with one another, and it's your job to fit them, make them be the right size. Now, if you need to return to moving the picture box, you've got to switch back to the black arrow and click again. Actually, click away, then click again on the picture box, and you can move it and slide it around. Now, if that picture happens to be the exact size you need, it is possible to adjust the picture frame to match the photo. Under the Object menu, you can go to Fitting. And this gives you a couple subtle options, like Fit Frame to Content, or Set Frame proportionally inside the, or set picture inside the frame proportionally, or Center Content. In this case, let's try Fit Frame to Content. So what that does is it's going to make that picture box the exact same size as the image. There we go. Or another one I could do is fit content proportionally. Well, what does that do? It's going to resize it to the smallest size and fit it inside the picture box. Hit undo, go back. So let's go back and do like fitting and fit frame to content. Now, what if I need to scale everything and I want to scale it all at once? This is where InDesign operates a little bit different than Illustrator does. The only way to scale the object while scaling the picture frame at the same time is to press a few buttons. You got to hold Command on your keyboard, Command or Control if you're a PC nerd, drag that box, and it's going to resize the picture with the frame. Got to hold Command when you're doing it. Now, if you need this picture to remain in proportion, which you do, you should also press Shift. So I would always press Command and Shift, making sure that the frame, picture, and box are resized or scaled proportionally, and they don't get distorted, because you never want to do this to a picture. You never want to stretch and squish a picture. Bad idea. All right, so that way you can kind of move, manipulate, resize your photo images, and reset them as needed. All right, one more thing. Let's say I actually want to set up a page that has columns. I need the baseline grid and I need columns, because wider pages and documents do require columns of text. It's kind of hard to read, long extended blocks of text. It's better to break it up into narrower columns. That's just easier to read. So this is where we can go to the layout menu and do margins and columns. All right, now just right here in that margins and columns dialog box, there is number of columns. I'm going to select 2, and you see it just dropped in the center column on that page. The gutter is the space between the columns, and depending on the scale, margin, and size of your document, this is going to be a different number for you. I typically stick with some round numbers, well, not round numbers, but consistent numbers like 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch. So 0.25, 3/8, 1/2 inch, depending on the document setup. Gutters are gutters. Keep them consistent with your margins, and use columns to help you divide and subdivide the page as needed, so that you can align those text boxes as necessary. Here on this same dialog box, if you needed to go back and change your margin for some reason, you can come back here and adjust margins and columns all at once right there inside that layout drop-down menu. All right, so hopefully that gives you some information on setting up basic documents using InDesign to set up your files. There are lots of other things you can get into. Obviously, there are entire classes dedicated to InDesign. This was meant to be just a little kickstart to get you set up with text boxes and picture boxes. Look on your sidebar for palettes and other things you might need, changing your fonts, adjusting your alignment or your pictures. So the window menu is your friend. Look for those dialog boxes that you might need to make adjustments. And check also the workspaces. Workspaces are set up with the most common palettes and tools available for whatever you're going to be doing. So if you're doing book layout, you might as well pick the workspace book layout, and that's going to give you access to those common tools and settings right off the bat. All right, so hope that helps. Thanks for listening this time. See you next time. Keep designing.